Right, good morning everybody, and thank you for turning up in the last week of term. And welcome to the last roundup for the Functions of Fiction lecture course, which ultimately revolved around the questions of what's the use of stories that aren't even true. I pointed out in the very beginning, right, that this is something that has intrigued me ever since I first read the question in so many words in Salman Rushdie's marvelous fairy tale novel, Haroun and the Sea of Stories. And basically, I could have called it that, right, but Functions of Fiction is slightly shorter. We ended up last week with two novels which are basically in the mode of what used to be called genre fiction. And I suggested that it seems these days that this distinction between real novels, which are literature, and genre fictions, which are entertainment, doesn't really hold up any longer. And in fact, some of the most interesting stuff in terms of using fictionality as a medium for making sense of the world is happening in what used to be called genre fiction. So not so much crime fiction, but science fiction, certainly fantasy fiction, and mostly in these kind of melanges of all these kind of genre modes, which are sometimes called new weird fiction or just weird fiction. And this has sort of reconfigured what I call the field of fiction. So in my roundup, I will start there. And the fundamental point, which was kind of brought home to me more or less accidentally, I didn't plan it like that, but when I was talking last week about Embassy Town by China Miéville, it occurred to me that the point of fiction relies very much on the distinction between representation and signification. Remember that in that novel we are on this planet on the outskirts of the galaxy called Arieka, and there are these creatures called the Arikei who have a language which doesn't signify. It does represent, though, but only when the thing that is represented does exist in the world, right? So you have a language which is purely referential, you can say. And you can now perhaps begin to see where the connection is, right? Because when we're writing fictional narratives, then we are creating meaningfully connected elements which simulate a world, but they don't have the connection to what actually exists, what could be referenced directly. So ultimately, fiction is probably the medium for the most extended exploration of the possibilities of lying, to use another word. That's also what the plot in Embassy Town revolves around. And of course, lying is not necessarily a bad thing. Lying can be very productive. Sometimes it saves relationships. Sometimes it saves your own sense of yourself. So we're kind of, to a certain extent, we rely on the resource of lying. And that's also what the Arikei kind of sense, that they would have a completely new potential for their existence if only they could cut off from this anchoring in referentiality or direct representation, one should perhaps say. So that's the starting point today, representation and signification, picking up from last week's texts. And I will then, on the other hand, go back to if you like, the systematic gist of what I developed, believe it or not, in my PhD thesis way back when, which is basically an attempt at going through the history of the novel, as I did in the lecture course, and then come up with a kind of chart of modes of writing and their different functions and different kinds of fiction which emerge from that. I didn't really think about that in the same terms as I would now, but I realized that the chart is very useful, so I brought that back in as a sort of crutch for me to sort of talk a little bit about the systematic implications. It's nice to realize that even, how long ago was that? 30 years ago, so one wasn't completely stupid. So there are a couple of interesting things in my PhD that I keep going back to, which I kind of like for my own sense of identity. I actually know colleagues who completely disavow their PhD as my own father even, who always said a PhD is just a Gesellenstück, right? So you need to have it, but then you can forget it. That was not the case with me. For me, this was actually, if you like, the foundation for great things to come. What I have since done, and that's also sort of something which occurred to me while I was sort of systematizing what I've been doing this semester, is I've kind of expanded the strict focus on the history of the novel into a cultural studies approach which has a similar scope, so roughly from the 18th century to the 20th century. And that ultimately amounts to this emergence of what I call here the field of fiction, or perhaps more accurately, the fields of fiction, if you really look beyond the literary fictions that I've been focusing on here. But we have different fields of fictional storytelling, you could say, and sometimes not necessarily storytelling, but sort of world building that we can rely on. Also, more or less spontaneously, in the very first lecture, I brought in this what then sort of emerged to me as this kind of leitmotif, this sense that we cannot really get out of the kind of webs of significance into which we spin ourselves continually. And we had this sort of frauds all the way down, or turtles all the way down. And it occurred to me then for the second lecture that I would have to explain that. In the meantime, I hit upon a very unlikely place where this phrase is also picked up on in country music. So I'll end today with a song by, he's not a card-carrying country singer of the conservative kind. He's more like an alternative country singer who has recently turned to become an outright, well, for want of a better word, rock and roller. It's an interesting guy, writes interesting lyrics, and there is his sort of breakthrough album had a single on it and an opening track, which is called Turtles All the Way Down. And it's really a weird song. I would not claim that I'll be able to completely explain it to you, but I had a sense that it ticks some of the boxes that we have been doing. And if it's Turtles All the Way Down anyway, we cannot possibly close it up completely. So that will be my ending note today. Quite literally a note, yes. So, representation and signification. In China Miéville's amazing novel Embassy Town, we heard last week, a distinction is made between language with a capital L and language with a lowercase l, or languages rather. So there is a sense that the language with the capital L that exists on that planet, Arieka, is perhaps singular, or that there may perhaps, who knows, in the wide universe, be more places where this kind of pure language, which exists in a kind of unified with reality and pure referentiality, exists. So these are the notions that come up here. So language is sort of the archetype. It emerges from reality by ways of reference. And then it gets corrupted. Or so some of the adherents of ideologies of purity would say, right? And the further away language moves from being anchored directly in reality, the more corrupted language is. And there is a whole faction in Embassy Town headed by, what's her name? Well, anyway, the narrated Avis, that's her name, right? Avis Banachot's husband, Siley, however he's pronounced, who is a linguist, who want to preserve the purity of the original language and keep the arike from evolving into the fallen state of signification, you could say, right? Lying in their terminology, or the immoral state of lying. So, the argument would roughly be that language with a capital L is based on reference, and then perhaps slightly looser on the representation of reality, but at any rate on actuality, right? What really exists. And we also saw that the Arikei, when they realize that the language, they don't understand it, but they do realize that the language that the humans bring to their outpost in Embassy Town, that works differently, and they are completely fascinated by that. And they also realize that they kind of extend the range of their language by letting humans enact similes, So humans, they bring humans to act something, and once it has been acted, it can be expressed in their language, right? And we saw that Avis also has the experience of that, because as a child, she was forced or brought to enact this very extended metaphor, which boiled down to the girl who was lying in a dark room where people used to eat and ate what was given to her, or something like that, something really creepy. And we never fully never fully learn what the ritual was really like. She just says, she'd rather not talk about it. And we also don't quite get what significance the existence of this simile actually has for the arike. So that remains a kind of an enigma. But anyway, we see that similes and metaphors, which are then conceptualized in this doublespeak that the two mouths of the arike have as lies that truth, or truthing lies, right? That this is a key point where actuality can be sort of tipped over into virtuality or potentiality. So language as we know it with the lowercase l indicates that representation, which sort of to a certain extent emancipates itself from direct reference to something which is immediately there into something which exists but can be referenced, right, is then absorbed into signification of actuality and potentiality. So it's not that actuality goes away. You can still say, well, this morning I ran into a lamppost, right, and the lamppost was very much there, and there's a reference and so on. But of course, I can also invent a story. In fact, I just did invent a story about running against a lamppost because I didn't. And I can say these things, right, just for the fun of it. Or because it occurs to me or whatever. So there's an immense liberating potential also here. And of course, fiction then is perhaps the most extended format for lies that truth or truthing lies, if you like. And I kind of have a sense that it would be useful to take over this terminology from the novel into the real world in order to do something with it. That is to say, a medium for exploring the potentiality of signification. If you have a background, which I don't think you have, but if you had a background, let's say, in sociological system theory, you would recognize that here, to me, these kinds of ideas kind of come naturally, because ever since my PhD way back when, I've been working with Luhmann's categories, and Luhmann has the category of Sinn, in German, Sinn. You already have a problem because Sinn in Luhmann's sense doesn't really translate neatly into English. It is not sense. It is also not meaning. It's somewhere between sense and meaning, and the only kind of adequate formulation we have in English for Sinn in Luhmann's sense would be in this phrase which I've employed frequently here, making sense, right? That is sort of turning something into meaning in a kind of process. Sinn, according to Luhmann, actually mediates the difference between actuality and potentiality. There you go, right? So there you can link it up to semiotics and so on. So there's a whole range of communication and its potential outcomes and how process links up to semantics and so on that can be uncoded with this highly sophisticated theoretical set of concepts. Now, we have seen that if you look at it that way, then it's not a fall into moral depravity and experience, as William Blake has it, from the at oneness of innocence, right? But actually, the move into signification, to a certain extent, probably makes human beings what they are as human beings, right? It has frequently been argued that what distinguishes human beings from other beings is consciousness. I'm not so sure, because I do think that my son's dog has a consciousness, right? It just operates differently from ours. But perhaps what really distinguishes us is perhaps signification. I mean, I wouldn't go to a philosophical congress to argue the case just now, but perhaps after thinking about it a little bit longer, this is something that you can argue, right? And the signification, of course, depends on the way in which we use language, whatever language. And there may be differences of significations with different languages. To state a kind of obvious case in point, when you happen to be using a Germanic language, like say English or German for that matter, and you have a sentence structure which is predicated on subject, predicate, object. There is a certain affinity to coming up with a huge philosophical worldview which distinguishes between subject and object, and the subject does something to the object. Descartes, for example, right? If you don't have that, other philosophies will emerge. I'm no expert, but I have a sense that Chinese traditions are seeing the world really differently, right? Or Buddhism, for that matter. So that's the kind of thing that is at stake here. This is not only a good thing, though, and in that sense, the purists do have a point, right? Because to a certain extent, these kind of, let's call them kind of non-grounded significations, can have an empowering and a delimiting function for whoever uses them or whoever receives them. It's also a difference whether you're actually producing fiction, and then you can use it for all kinds of things which are good for you, right? Or whether fictions are sort of thrown at you, either directly or through political systems or through the media or whatever, and you don't really have a sense that you can kind of really estimate whether they are good for you, to what extent they're grounded in reality. Well, let's build a holiday resort in Gaza. What we end up with then is the fact that fictions are all around. The ones that we looked at are all anchored in literature, and literature is to a certain extent perhaps a kind of subset of art very much concerned with language use, so there's that. But of course, to a certain extent, any painting also creates a kind of fictional, if you like, view of the world, right? If only because it arrests it. So it uses a kind of delimiting function in order to create greater clarity, for example. So you can think about all kinds of media in that respect. But of course, the media and the art practices, if you like, do not happen in sort of a kind of empty space, but they are also embedded completely in politics, perhaps other kind of worldview framing discourses, if we want to use that word, or systems, or whatever you want to call them, like religion. The economy, according to Luhmann, for example, money is a communication medium. And it's true, right? I give you money, you give me something, we are communicating, not in so many words, but so it's an interesting take on the world. And of course, media environments, and I think currently we are sort of living out the implications of this Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times, and yes, here we do. What makes them particularly interesting, if not outright worrisome, is the fact that apparently the media regime, which lends stability to certain assumptions about the world that have been held for a long time, that is to say a media regime based on print, is giving way to a media regime based on digital technologies and algorithms. So that is basically sort of the fundamental setup in which functions of fiction would have to be discussed. Fiction, I repeat, is basically the most extended format for lies that truth, or for truthing lies. So the question, what is the use of stories that aren't even true, is answered by that, right? They are truthing lies. But not necessarily, and that brings us to the second text from last week's program, R.F. Kuang's Babel, or The Necessity of Violence, an Arcane History of the Oxford Translator Guild. And here, of course, we can see that it's not only ever about finding out the truth or the best possible insight into how the world works and so on, but fictions also establish institutions, power relations. They establish, as the Marxists would have it, hegemony, to use Gramsci's term. And of course, for us in English studies, the most obvious example and the most influential one, probably for the global setup of things, is the British Empire. And it's not over, right? As you can see in the fact that Brexit actually took place, sort of moving from a fiction into a political reality. We have a very parallel structural development with the Make America Great, in brackets again, ideology, because let's face it, the US is also an imperial nation. And you can then sort of go on to wherever you want, Turkey, India, whatnot, Germany, why not, right? And of course, these fictions of power and hegemony, we could actually look closer to home here, right? At the Third Reich, which is an all-inclusive totalitarian fiction of power and hegemony. He seems even a too diplomatic term for what was aimed for there. I mentioned last week in passing that there are these two books which I would highly recommend to anybody who studies English. They're a good read. They are full of, well, what we have to take as non-fictional factual information, right? Because there's a lot of research that has gone into it, but perhaps we have to kind of acknowledge the fact that all the kind of affairs from the British Empire that are comments upon here have largely been taken from other texts and earlier accounts and so on. But there's a huge awareness in these books by Satnam Sanghera of the fact that what we then take to be true is discursively produced, right? So what historians write about the empire will always have some slant. And I can't quite remember when that was, but I guess it must have been something like 2013. I did a seminar on fictions of empire, which was largely predicated on this wonderful trilogy of novels by J.G. Farrell, the Anglo-Irish writer. He has written one book called Troubles about the Irish Civil War in the early 20th century, a second novel called The Siege of Krishnapur about the, well, what the British call the Indian Mutiny and what the Indians call the First War of Independence, and a third one about the fall of Singapore. What's that one called? The Singapore Gap, I think, towards the end of the Second War, 1943 or 4, I think. So these are marvelous novels. So that was part of the program, fictions, right, about the empire, where you learn a lot about Ireland, India, and Singapore. But we also read in excerpts assessments of what the British Empire was from various historians, and that was also really interesting because then when you put them side to side, you see the different slants. There is, for example, Ian Kershaw, was it Ian? No, Niall Ferguson, I think is I'm talking about here, who has a kind of, let's say, pro-empire slant. And he basically argues, yes, there were downsides to the empire, but ultimately modernization was kind of driven by, so that kind of thing, right? And there were other historians beginning to emerge which had an empirical, extremely critical slant on the empire. Personally speaking, I have to say that because I come from this sort of functional academic system theory, sociology background of a theory of modernity, I am, let's put it like that, I'm now much less inclined to believe in Ferguson's more positive version of imperial history than in some of the other stuff that I read then. So these are historians. Are we reading fictions? Well, probably not by the standards of historiography, but of course, ultimately, culturally speaking, yes, right? Because we read different narrative slants on the same historical events or on a particular selection of historical events from a particular historical context. This is just sort of the latest sort of incarnation of this ongoing debate in Britain, and these books are written in a fairly accessible way, and they are kind of saturated with information which you have no real reason to doubt, right? And also create this kind of highly critical slant on empire without really sort of posing these questions. I want to answer the question, was empire a good thing or not? He basically says, well, what of it, right? It's there. So how do we deal with it? What are the different reactions and how can we get something positive out of that? It was really an enjoyable experience reading these books. So to go into the recapitulation phase, here is what I call here a map of modern fiction and a map of postmodern fiction, which evolved in the course of roughly the first half of my PhD way back when. And you remember that we did the rise of the novel, we did this kind of backlash of Gothic fiction and sentimental fiction, we talked about the realist synthesis, and we talked about the sort of turn of the novel into an art form with modernism, and then sort of the shift of all these sort of programs of the novel which came one after the other into this kind of simultaneity of postism or postmodernism. And this is an attempt at sort of distilling from all that the possible orientations of fiction. And looking back at it now, I find that it's still kind of useful. If you look to the left of the scheme, you see that there is what I call here documentary fiction. And that's a kind of tricky topic, as we already heard when I was talking about historians, similarly with documentary, right? So where exactly is the boundary between something which is a proper documentary and, on the other hand, something which is perhaps a slightly differently angled literary documentary? I had a PhD student dealing with this, with the extensive doses of Latour. Was a very interesting work. And at the end of the day, I mean, it's a bit like this hammer and nail thing, right? If the only tool that you have is a hammer, everything will become a nail. If the tool that you have is one which comes from the tradition of literary studies as it moves into cultural studies, you would have a certain bias towards realizing that whatever a documentary is doing, right, it is something that is being done and it is not objective, right? By definition, it's not objective. So in a way, it's always already fiction. Of course, people who come from other academic backgrounds would not see it that way with such clarity, but there has been an increasing acknowledgement, I think, of the made-upness of the views of the world that are produced, even in documentary. So that means, and sometimes it's kind of amazing to see what got accepted as a documentary. For example, the film Man of Erin by Robert Flaherty from 1932 or thereabouts, a film about life on the Aran Islands off the west coast of Ireland, which counts in film history sometimes as the first documentary film. So Flaherty carried all his cumbersome equipment onto the Aran Islands. He rented a hut there. He had a film crew over. And then he did filming, so he was on location. So in that sense, some of the footage that you get is what you would probably call documentary, right? Because it documents what it was like or what it looked like on the Aran Islands in the early 1930s. So far, so good. But then the ultimate film that you're watching, and I highly recommend that you do watch it, it's a silent film. It comes across very differently. It does have these, what do you think, these cue cards, right, text, right, which give you a little bit of a story. You have a kind of sea-like waving soundtrack of post-romantic symphonic orchestration of fishermen's tunes from the Irish West Coast, you know, meandering around in the background and sometimes also in the foreground. And then you have a story, which of course wasn't there. And the family that you're observing, a nuclear family of husband who goes fishing, wife who stays at home, and the son who wants to follow in the footsteps of his father, they didn't exist on the island. He cast 3 islanders who he deemed to have talent for acting in the roles of these people, gave them a cottage to build an artificial home, and then sort of you get this kind of, it's more like a visual poem, right, of this life of the nuclear family against the elements on the Aran Islands, including gathering seaweed in order to put it on the crevices in the rocks until it rots, and then you get a little bit of soil in which you can grow, wait for it, potatoes, yes. Or they go fishing in their little curers, as they're called, right? These sort of rowing boats which are special to the west coast of Ireland in very adverse weather conditions, and they are hunting sharks. Well, shark hunting stopped in the mid of the 19th century, so it's a dramatization, right? It's presenting the life much more. So is it the first documentary? Nope. Why did people believe so long that it was the first documentary? Well, because they had a kind of selective attention to the technique of filming things on location, I guess. For me, it's more like a visual poem. I really love the film, right? I'm not speaking against it. I'm just pointing out that it's not fulfilling my standards for documentary. If there is the possibility of doing a documentary. Ultimately, you would just have to put a camera on the island and let it sit there for a month and then create a month's worth of footage and have people watch that, which they won't do, right? So the real documentary would have to be as extensive and unruly as real life. So it's always a condensation, that's what I'm saying. So there is this kind of push towards fiction, if only by reducing the available material in one way or the other. But of course, the documentary has this kind of what can be called an avant-garde impulse to step outside of the realm of art, right? Even if you say that documentary film or fiction, doesn't really matter, is an art form, you're already sort of undermining the credibility of the documentary, because art is fashioning things, right? So documentary is perhaps a starting point for what fiction can do. And of course, there are many fictions which purport to be really very, very, very close to what really was the case. We have talked at length not about documentary fiction at the beginning of my story, but about the rise of the novel in terms of realism. And I think what emerged from that is, when we move slightly to the right here, is that ultimately this already gives the view onto the world a much more explicitly acknowledged, or sometimes not acknowledged, but a kind of implicitly acknowledged subjective slant. So you see this little shorthand in what I call orientations of meaning at the bottom of the chart. In German, that is a Sinndimension. So you can see Luhmann's conception of meaning / sense, making sense in there somehow. And you can see that just for this, I'm not believing in it, but for the sake of systematicity, you could argue that on the documentary side, sort of this ideal of objectivity holds sway, even if it cannot be fully fulfilled. But then when we move into the realm of realism, we move into the realm of what I call in cultural studies lectures realist vision, which sort of embodies subjective points of view. You can see how the objective, which is still very much valued, but it's supplemented by the subjective dimension, right? Then, of course, you have fictions which turn against the kind of commonsensical orthodox way of seeing the world, beginning perhaps with the emergence of the paradigm of the Künstlerroman from the paradigm of the Bildungsroman. So the Bildungsroman is kind of predicated on, well, there may be these young people with all their aspirations, they do all these kinds of foolish things, but in the end they come around and end up as useful adults in society, right? So you can kind of see how this gravitates towards objectivity. That's the way it is. But you have, with the Künstlerroman, perhaps the first paradigm of revisionist fiction in which these aspiring young people cannot be accommodated by society any longer. And in that case, of course, the one point for refuge, which doesn't throw them completely out of bounds, would be art. So they can become painters, right? Or novelists, for that matter. Though in the 19th century, perhaps novelists wouldn't yet qualify fully as artists, right? But poets are good. So there you can see that with revisionist fiction, the accent really moves towards the subjective, and this sort of acknowledgement of the prose of circumstance, as Hegel would have it, as the objective reality is diminished. And then, of course, from there, all the kind of revisionist agendas that you could possibly imagine take off: feminist, class, post-colonial, whatever, right? So that's this kind of, and of course, sometimes to make your point, you have to create a kind of alternative realism, right? So there's a strong linkage between the two. And then, of course, at some point, when, say, a post-colonial writer writes a long novel, a novel which sort of acknowledges the kind of all the bad things that colonialism did to the protagonist, then in order to make the point about how the world really is, the novel will be written in basically a realist mode, right? Just to say, look, it's not like that, but it's like this. And then from there, we of course saw that from the very beginning, there was a kind of an awareness of the mechanisms of depicting the world built into the genre of the novel, right? Even Robinson Crusoe occasionally, very briefly and not very, consequentially, reflects upon the fact that he's sort of trying to make sense of what is happening to him and what has happened to him and how useful his father's advice was in the beginning and all of that. And then, of course, we can see that once this self-consciousness comes to the fore, most prominently, perhaps, and programmatically, first in The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy in the 1750s by Lawrence Sterne. Then we move the accent onwards from subjective to literature, literary, or even emphatically literary. That's what the underlining kind of indicates, right? Then sort of when you read The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, the objective world kind of recedes from view. We only have his opinions, basically, right? So that's the subjective thing, and it doesn't get more subjective than that. But at the same time, why do we know all that? Well, because there is a literary medium available which can accommodate that, right? The novel. So there is this, and then of course, if this model is taken up, it can become ever more explicitly and emphatically literary, right? If not inside the novel, then you have a later development, much later in fact, when Linda Hutcheson identifies historiographic metafiction as the key genre of postmodernism. So that is of course based on novels like Midnight's Children. Midnight's Children, though, in one of its dimensions takes its cue from Tristram Shandy, right? So it could have been called The Life and Opinions of Salem Sinai. But it has a much more history and politics oriented outlook than Tristram Shandy. And then we have this alternative between implicit and explicit metafiction. You will frequently find a kind of unspoken assumption that the more outright metafictional passages you get in a book, the more metafictional it will be. So there's, for example, quite influential and also quite useful work by Ansgar Nünning along those lines. He has a Habilitationsschrift which was published in 2 volumes at the time called Von historischer Fiktion zu historiographischer Metafiktion. Now there's a German title. And his argument sort of pushes it slightly in that direction. At the same time, Werner Wolf, who is, I think, still in Graz University, wrote a fat Habilitationsschrift published in 1 volume but with hardcover to hold it together, called Illusion und Illusionsdurchbrechung im englischen Roman. And he has a very good part on metafiction, and I think he put me on the path of realizing, that's perhaps not true. Because if you have a narrator who explicitly reflects for pages on end on problems of how to write fiction, how to write things, that is all kind of also containing it, right? The really radical metafictions are perhaps not the explicit one, but the implicit ones, right? And we had so far, I think the most radical example I know is probably Darkness Visible by William Golding, where ultimately when you finish the novel, you are asked for the sleep of faith, which you can either do or not do. But because you are asked for it, and there are 2 options where you could possibly leap, right, secularly or religiously, this sort of casts an implicitly metafictional light on the whole thing that went before. And that's perhaps much more unsettling than having somebody reflect upon the difficulties of telling a story properly for pages on end. So that's why I ended up putting it sort of like this, but you can also kind of see that perhaps I got it wrong, because I would probably say that, come to think of it now, that the brackets should go there, right? And because it's in the explicit variety that the subjectivity of the narrator stabilizes the reflexive dimension. So what all this amounts to is that you get a kind of sense of how I'm thinking, right? I do this kind of systematizing thing, and that's why I love to work with Ingrid Hodge-Davis, because she usually does everything else but not that, right? And sort of whenever I talk to her, I learn something which I didn't fully register, and I think it's the same with her. She always said, whenever I talk to you, I see something which I couldn't sort of wrap my head around. So when we're together, we're really good, I think. So I'm not looking forward to the day that she retires. I also point out that, and it's just like that, I realize now, while I'm speaking, right, that if I did it now, I would perhaps change that around, right? And I would perhaps put the bracket somewhere else. So all of these things, and I think that applies to anybody. Don't let any professor tell you that what they've been doing is sort of the last word on things, but it's a kind of ongoing set of coordinates which they use to spin their particular slant on whatever it is that they're dealing with, literature, other cultural practices or whatever, and basically this applies to all disciplines. But of course, I think in literary studies, the leeway is slightly larger than in chemistry, right? Because you do not have to follow protocol for experiments, which is completely specificating what you will, but you're kind of thinking, right? And I can also report, and this ties in with the topic here, that for me, and I kind of began to learn that towards the end of my studies, naively you would think you are thinking something and then you write it down in your term paper. It's not like that for me at all. I have an idea, and then I make a plan, and then sort of the thinking to a certain extent delegates itself into the writing process itself. And I had a very formative experience in one of my seminars, which I keep telling again and again, where I started a term paper with an agenda, and I ended up writing a term paper which proved the opposite. So I wanted to write a term paper which was to prove that Karl Kraus, Die letzten Tage der Menschheit, The Last Days of Mankind, with this acute criticism of the press coverage of the First World War, that is true, a truly sophisticated critique of the press, as opposed to a slightly daft play by Arthur Schnitzler called Fink und Fliederbusch, which is also about criticizing the press, and which I thought when I started is just one of those, late impressionistic weird things, which is not really good. Turns out, Kraus is quite a good satirist, right? But it's not particularly sophisticated. On closer inspection, Fink and Fliederbusch, it's actually a pretty sophisticated play. And kind of, this was told to me by the thing that I was writing at the time, right? So, and I've been ever since I've been kind of open to now it's a screen, right? Let's talk back to me and perhaps tell me things which I wasn't able to think beforehand. I'm telling you that not in order to indicate that I'm a weirdo or whatever, but I think probably in a way this applies generally to the way we are in the world, right? So if it is good for you if you can be open to things that come from the outside, which tell you things which you couldn't conceptualize yourself, and then use that material in order to project your own fiction, if you want to use the term, back outside. So you can see that in a way this function of fiction question extends way beyond fiction as a genre or the novel or whatever, but it's a kind of cultural practice, and it's deeply enmeshed with the ways language is used. Which brings me to the third extension of the field, and that's what I wrote about towards the end of one of the long chapters in the Handbook of the English Novel. And you can see how this sort of touches back to the chart that we just looked at. And in fact, I did have the chart next to my desk when I was sort of writing up. In fact, my original plan was to come up with a new chart. And to be honest, I couldn't do it. I could do nothing, and I really tried, which sort of improved on what was there. I was, for various reasons, no longer fully satisfied with the chart that I just showed you. So in the end, I ended up just writing a full text, right? Trying to capture what I want to say in prose. In a way, I'm narrating the field of fiction into being again. So I'm quoting here. It's actually even longer than that, but I'm quoting here because this is what I managed to come up with in 2017 or thereabouts. So what I call the field of fiction is a virtual map. See, it should have been a real map, but I couldn't do it because it's too multidimensional. You cannot put it on the page, right? Somehow it didn't work. So it's a virtual map for tracing the shift in dynamics or orientation, I guess, and affiliation that characterizes the production of long fictional narratives in the 20th century and beyond. Note again, the scope of that book was Handbook of the English Novel of the 20th and 21st century, so I'm not really branching out fully here, but perhaps I should in the future. For historical and systematic reasons, the center of the map is occupied by realism, which precariously balances the tensions generated by its double-edged project of, on the one hand, deconstructing and supplanting pre-modern codes of making sense of the world. So there is a critical project built into realism on the one hand, while on the other hand, at the same time, constructing bourgeois subjectivity. So if you go back to the chart, you can see that is why subjectivity sort of comes to the fore when you move to the right in the chart, right? Realism's balance of showing and telling caters to the experiential predispositions of the bourgeois subject by presenting the world in a fashion similar to the ways in which any reader can see it, and by making sense of it and with the emergent hegemony of the allegedly neutral middle-class perspective grounded in the common sense shared by all individuals of this class. And again, I would admit to taking quite a full time to to not be absorbed into the ideological, stories that have been told about what literature is doing. By now, I'm fully aware of the fact that it's ultimately a kind of middle-class universality, and a white one at that, right? But perhaps it also took, among other things, not only the progress of research and insight in literary studies, but also the diversification of the student body that I'm confronted with, right? We have people here from India, Pakistan, China, wherever. Not all of the students who are sitting here are safely middle class as they used to be when I started my academic career. You barely ever found anybody who was not from a middle class background, right? So the world is changing. Well, not exactly a surprising insight, but at some point you'll be old enough to also realize it yourself, right? At the same time, the telling component of realism necessarily brings a potentially destabilizing subjective component to the hegemonic project of legitimate and useful representation, and this subjective dimension also potentially foregrounds the fact that a novel is just a novel. That is a representation and a fictional one at that. So again, we can kind of see it always moves in one direction, but at the same time it moves in the other. It's a complex thing, this fictionality. Note also that this component, this destabilizing subjective component with regard to the hegemonic project of legitimate and useful representation, the example would be the Künstlerroman, right? There we have this sort of destabilizing element quite clearly. In the end, the subject of narrative is not integrated into society, but there is this sort of special reservation in which these types can somehow keep on doing what they feel necessary to do. So this amounts to an inbuilt tendency towards self-consciousness. Note the shift towards metafiction of various kinds to the right of the chart, which comes to the fore with the turn of the novel into modernism in an attempt at turning a perceived weakness, that is realism's perceived self-consciousness, into strength. And interestingly, it is with this inward turn towards epistemological questions circling around the perceived gap between language and world, note the insights of Embassy Town, that the novel can actually claim a kind of universal relevance, albeit of a more deconstructive kind. All in all, this trajectory can be described as a shift from realism's reliance on telling, albeit in sublimated, invisibilized form. Think Jane Austen, right? There's not a lot of explicit telling, but it is a telling, right? There is an authorial narrator in Jane Austen, and a tone is present. To modernism's showing of thought and perception, which is, after all, not showing at all, but a translation into language simulating showing. To postmodernism's awareness of the linguistic and discursive constructiveness of both modes of representation. And by now we're probably wondering what could be added to the sentence in terms of postmodernism. Revaluation of materiality, the rejection of irony, the turn towards sincerity. So some of these things are kind of backward looking. I think sincerity is not a particularly useful term in that respect, but this turn towards materiality and the materiality of mediality, to turn the screw one further, I think that is something which we witnessed in novels like Tom McCarthy's Staten Island, for example, and The Blue Book by A.L. Kennedy, and so on. So, there we are with the novel in the 20th and 21st century, but as I indicated, there are of course other fields of fiction. And of course, very influentially these days, visual fictions have perhaps a more, quantitatively certainly, a more pervasive influence on how these fictional worldviews that are catered to you by all kinds of films, and these days perhaps particularly television, or what used to be television series. These days we should probably just say series, I guess, right? So I think that is interesting. I mean, nobody would seriously doubt, not even in literary studies, that films reach more people than novels do, right? But then again, I think with examples like, say, The Overstory by Richard Powers, or Happy by Nicola Barker, it's also quite clear that novels can do things that films cannot do, one problem. And the second thing is that the mode of visual representation employed in films and series is, of course, very much tied up, not necessarily, but by habit, you could say, tied up with the convention of realist vision. Note the techniques of Hollywood continuity editing, right? Where you have, for example, if I remember correctly, the 180-degree rule, so that once you've placed the camera, you would have to take care that it only sort of ever moves within 180 degrees from the angle of the particular character that is meant to be at the center. And that is, of course, in order to create a sense of continuity between the ways in which we are perceiving the world. So when I'm standing here, I have this, 180-degree kind of field of vision, same to you, but in the other direction, and continuity editing techniques cater to that, right? That's good. I like watching these films. That's not the problem, right? But of course, it's also to a certain extent naturalizing something which is very artificial, because every film ultimately is a construction. And it is not like you would naively think that the camera records something that is in front of the camera, and thus whatever is shown in a film is ontologically there. In films, everything is constructed and put in front of the camera, right? And it's a kind of similar argument to narrative theory, where for a long time there was this sense that the narrator recounts an event, right? So the event is first and the narrator comes along and recounts it. And only with the sort of post-structuralist revolution and discourse analysis and all that has the insight that ultimately every narrator constructs the event in the first place, right? The way things are selected and put together in a sequence actually brings forth the reality of the event for that particular story, but then another one may tell a slightly different story, so that kind of thing. So these visual fictions are certainly there, much more marginalized, but also perhaps pervasively there are what I call here oral fiction. So of course opera as a kind of multimedia spectacle gives you a kind of story on a stage, these days also sometimes filmed, right? And then there's the music and all kinds of special effects and so on. But perhaps in a slightly more linear way, take rock music and pop music, right? So before the advent of music video in the 1980s through MTV, of course, this was really just oral, right? So when you look at the history of rock and pop music from the 1950s to, say, the end of the 70s, then you have a kind of oral mediality for spinning fictions. And the fictions are not normally extensively narrated, but they just create sort of persona, you could say. So you have this kind of, I don't know, Mick Jagger persona and a John Lennon persona, a Paul McCartney persona. And that, of course, goes on and is then enhanced multimedially with the arrival of music video. And then you have a Madonna persona. And Bob Dylan himself has at least 12 persona, except the one who he possibly really is, if he can still remember. I also ask myself sometimes, oh, he has to vacate it, right? When Udo Lindenberg wakes up in the morning in a suite in the Hotel Atlantic in London, in Hamburg, is there a kind of a real Udo Lindenberg looking into the mirror, or has Udo Lindenberg kind of vanished into his image? Does he have a hat on when he's looking into the mirror? These kinds of questions, right? But I think he has to move because they want to refurbish these, so that will be hard. I'm actually interested in the large-scale project that I currently have in this intriguing fact that rock and pop music demarcates a kind of intermediary position between sort of the end of print culture and the real onset of digital culture. So particularly between 1965 and the early 80s, we have a very popular mediality which operates with recorded music. Most of it not recorded in performance, but kind of specifically constructed in recording studios, which is nevertheless used to project fictions, right? Certain persona, either closer to the one who's actually singing it, sometimes really outright sort of third-person narrative. So that's all there, but it's an interesting intermediary phase in terms of media history. Then, of course, from the 80s onwards, we have these multimedia fictions, music videos, social media, and, of course, also media bubbles, as they have been called, right? So there's a certain tendency for certain sort of communicative mechanisms to seclude themselves so that only ever the same ideas are ventilated. And through all of that, and all the time, and also from the beginning, we have what, following Michel Foucault, we could call discourses, right? So there's a discourse of politics, which is at odds with the discourse of religion, and at odds with the discourse of art and the discourse of literature, the discourse of science. And we are currently now seeing that there is a a huge integrative impulse on the level of media environments, while at the same time the validity of certain discourses are, of course, still upheld, right? So, to put it a bit bluntly, perhaps science is truer than politics. Well, politicians don't like it, right? So here we go. And then they spin their fictions and try to get some independence from that. So what all this amounts to is that fact and fiction cannot be fully separated at the end of the day. This is from a book by Albrecht Koschorke, who is a professor of German literature in Constance. What's the German title? Wahrheit und Erzählung, I think, originally. Eine Einführung in die allgemeine Erzähltheorie or something like that. Grundzüge einer allgemeinen Erzähltheorie. It's a fat book. I honestly do not recommend that you read the German version. It's as dry as it gets. It's great in terms of content, but not fun. But somebody translated it into English, and it lost some 200 pages in the process, and it reads much better, and also has a snappier title, Fact and Fiction, Elements of a General Theory of Narrative. And so here's some of the insights that he came up with. That institutional orders rest on regulated fictions and nevertheless, or for just that reason, possess the force of reality is an insight that meanwhile has been integrated into many areas of the social sciences and historiography. Genealogical myth underpinning the right to inheritance, privilege, or rule leave no doubt concerning the narrative character of such foundational constructions. So here's sort of another field of fiction, if you like, right? The kind of legal fictions which are based on all kinds of cultural conventions, and then because they are practical on the one hand, and because they serve the interest of some dominating class, have been implemented and now kind of taken for granted as things as they are, basically, right? Narrative theory, he goes on, which within literary studies naturally developed from treatment of literary texts, and what I told you about my own sort of academic biography kind of indicated just that, starting out with a novel and then sort of branching out into larger cultural studies areas. Narrative theory has not been properly prepared for such an expansion of competency. Especially the conceptual pair of fictional and factual narration has not been sufficiently nuanced to render understandable the difference and interaction, the separation history and repeatedly renewed synergies between factographic and fictional representational procedures. And the last sentence of this whole book, and as I said in German, it's way longer than in English, is, what is truth, what fiction remains undecidable? Turtles all the way down and all that, right? So this is really, it's a really profound attempt at getting at the heart of what narrative is doing culturally. And it's really great that somehow this was also translated into English and is a bit more manageable in the English version. So if it's undecidable, we should just perhaps forget about the distinction between truth and fiction and really sort of look at what kind of cultural work these processes of necessary processes of fictionalization are actually doing. And this is where a collection of essays edited by Ansgar Nünning and what's her name, Polland Schmand, 2021 comes in with this called The Cultural Work of Fictions. And basically the idea for this is taken from this very, very influential book by the cognitive linguists Lakoff and Johnson from 1980 with the title Metaphors We Live By. So in Metaphors We Live By, Lakoff and Johnson argued that basically our sense of the world is governed by metaphors, right? So truthing lies, as other people have it. And this is the argument that sort of the truthing lies, Lakoff and Johnson, and now sort of onto the cultural work of fiction that Polland, Schmand, and Nünning pick up, insisting on the plurivalent sense of literary fiction and cultural fictions that individuals and societies live by, right? So here are a couple of statements from that particular book. In today's society, they write, regularly dubbed a or the post-truth era, in which whole political agendas are built on so-called alternative facts, fake news or bullshit in the sense of Harry G. Frankfurt, we are witnessing an increasing tendency to blur distinctions between facts and fiction. So this diagnosis is very similar to the one that Kushorp came up with, right? And then they follow this up with the following observation in the introduction. Our cultural fictions may well often be convenient untruths, but they also seem to be very useful because they fulfill certain functions and do important cultural work. In that respect, economic, ideological, and legal fictions resemble works of art and literature in that the latter also do cultural work. So if you want to understand what's happening, why not use the kind of knowledge that you have from dealing with literary fictions for dealing with legal fictions, for example, or economic fictions, or any given pronouncement by Donald Trump. I end up with this, and then I'll have a couple of treats. Tabish Kerr, of whom I told you about this wonderful novel called Thing About Thugs, has come up with a book called Literature and Fundamentalism. And in the introductory chapter, he basically gives a plea for the functionality of literary fictions, and by extension also why literary studies as cultural studies is perhaps important, in spite of what other people may think. My argument in this book, Tabish writes, is simply that literature is a particular use of language that works with and not against the essential slipperiness of the mutual relationship between language and reality. So this univocal reference that language with a capital L seems to promise as purity, if we had a language like that, I wouldn't be standing here talking to you, right? It's a theoretical ideal, but it's not really productive, one could probably say. So what is productive is, in fact, the slipperiness. So it's not that slipperiness is a defect of language, but slipperiness is what makes language eminently useful as a medium for making sense of the world. And this is where literature differs, Tabish points out, from other disciplinary uses of language, because normally outside of literature, uses of language are about sort of disciplining the slipperiness, right? When you write a text for purposes of law enforcement, it must be as clear as possible. Now, we all know that even that doesn't work, right? Because then finally something happens and you find yourself before the judge. There will be two parties arguing about what the text of the law actually means and how it pertains to what you actually did or did not in that particular moment. So you can try to regulate it, and sometimes it works quite well. Every once in a while we do have an instruction manual for assembling some piece of furniture, which makes it easy to do it, but we also kind of know that every once in a while we have one that doesn't do the job, right? Or perhaps it's just us. So I think that is the point here. And remember also that the problem goes back to quotations from John Locke, which I gave you in lecture 3 or 4 or thereabouts, where he talks about the abuses of language, right? And then has this idea, language is slippery, but we have to come up with rules which make sure that it's used in an unslippery way. And so good academic, philosophical discourse should be transparency, it would be clear in its meaning, etc. All the things we tell you for your term papers. Does it work? Sometimes. But even the best term papers have a certain degree of linguistic slipperiness to it. And perhaps the really bad term papers don't have that, right? Again, the slipperiness is perhaps also where the productiveness lies. So that means that the discipline of literary studies, no matter whether it is liberal humanism or postcolonialism, often fails to address literature precisely because of its insistence of disciplining it for postcolonial purposes, for the ideological agenda of the bourgeoisie, that would be liberal humanism, right? This sort of subjective self-improvement and all that, right? Eternal moral values, whatnot. Feminist agendas and so on. The really interesting text would, to a certain extent, by necessity, undercut clear-cut political agendas and indicate that things are more complicated than that, not only because of the slipperiness of language, but also because of the slipperiness of human beings, perhaps, and the slipperiness of some slopes. So it is in exactly this sense that literature as literature is an antidote to not just religious fundamentalism, but also all other kinds of fundamentalism, political, for example. And this is where we come to this. Because you may be aware of the fact that Salman Rushdie really ran into trouble with the fourth novel, The Satanic Verses. It is debatable to a certain extent to what extent certain representations were necessary or not, and so on. But what is kind of amazing in Rushdie is that he really didn't succumb at any point, also not after this knife attack, which happened 2 years ago, I think, to any sort of destructive negativity or fatalism and so on. And amazingly, while he was already in hiding, he wrote this little book for his son Zafar in order to sort of keep up contact with the son with whom he couldn't keep up contact anymore. And note that as a kind of epigraph, but kind of very close to the text proper, you get a little poem which goes asserting the power of fiction, if you like. Zembla, Zenda, Xanadu, all our dream worlds may come true, fairylands are fearsome too. As I wander far from view, read and bring me home to you. And the first letters of every line form the name Zafar. So quite a moving statement. So I thought I would talk a little bit about that, because this is the book where this what's the use of stories that aren't even true question comes up. But I found, as with some of the best books, that it's kind of pointless to talk about it. It's perhaps better if I read it to you. The more so because this is a fairy tale, right? And fairy tales are meant to be read to people. So feel free to fall asleep if you're used to falling asleep when somebody's reading to you. But I just read to you a little bit, and you will get this sort of performative sound of this. There was once, in the country of Aleph Bay, a sad city, the saddest of cities, a city so ruinously sad that it had forgotten its name. It stood by a mournful sea full of glumfish, which were so miserable to eat that they made people belch with melancholy, even though the skies were blue. In the north of that sad city stood mighty factories in which, so I'm told, sadness was actually manufactured. Note here perhaps also a little critique of capitalism, possibly, right? Packaged and sent all over the world, which never seemed to get enough of it. Black smoke poured out of the chimneys of the sadness factories and hung over the city like bad news. And in the depths of the city, beyond an old zone of ruined buildings that looked like broken hearts, there lived a happy young fellow by the name of Harun, the only child of the storyteller Rashid Khalifa, whose cheerfulness was famous throughout that unhappy metropolis, and whose never-ending stream of tall, short, and winding tales had earned him not one but two nicknames. To his admirers, he was Rashid, the ocean of notions, as stuffed with cheery stories as the sea was full of glumfish. But to his jealous rivals, he was the Shah of Blah. Note also that the potential and the limitations of fiction are both here, right? In nicer form than I could possibly have put it. To his wife, Soraya, Rashid was for many years as loving a husband as anyone could wish for. And during these years, Harun grew up in a home in which, instead of misery and frowns, he had his father's ready laughter and his mother's sweet voice raised in song. Then something went wrong. Maybe the sadness of the city finally crept in through the windows. The day Soraya stopped singing in the middle of a line, as if someone had thrown a switch, Harun guessed there was trouble brewing, but he never suspected how much. Rashid Khalifa was so busy making up and telling stories that he didn't notice that Soraya no longer sang, which probably made things worse. But then Rashid was a busy man. In constant demand, he was the ocean of notions, the famous Shah of Blah. And what with all his rehearsals and performances, Rashid was so often on stage that he lost track of what was going on in his own home. Note again the dangers of fiction, right? He sped around the city and the country telling stories, while Soraya stayed at home turning cloudy and even a little thunderous and brewing up quite a storm. Harun went with his father whenever he could because the man was a magician, it couldn't be denied. He would climb up on some little makeshift stage in a dead-end alley packed with raggedy children and toothless old-timers, all squatting in the dust. And once he got going, even the city's many wandering cows would stop and cock their ears, and monkeys would jabber approvingly from rooftops, and the parrots in the trees would imitate his voice. Harun often thought of his father as a juggler, because his stories were really lots of different tales juggled together, and Rashid kept them going in a sort of dizzy whirl and never made a mistake. Where did all these stories come from? It seemed that all Rashid has to do was part his lips in a plump red smile, and out would pop some brand new saga, complete with sorcery, love interest, princesses, wicked uncles, fat aunts, mustachioed gangsters in yellow check pants, fantastic locations, cowards, heroes, fights, and half a dozen catchy, hummable tunes. Everything comes from somewhere, Harun reasoned, so these stories can simply come out of thin air. But whenever he asked his father his most important of questions, the Shah of Blah would narrow his, to tell the truth, slightly bulging eyes, and pat his wobbly stomach and stick his thumb between his lips while he made ridiculous drinking noises, gluk, gluk, gluk. Harun hated it when his father acted this way. No, come on, where do they come from really, he'd insist, and Rashid would wiggle his eyebrows mysteriously and make witchy fingers in the air. From the great sea story. Oh, the great story sea, he'd reply. I drink the warm story waters and then I feel full of steam. Harun found the statement intensely irritating. Where do you keep this hot water then? He argued craftily. In hot water bottles, I suppose? Well, I've never seen any. It comes out of an invisible tap installed by one of the water genies, said Rashid with a straight face. You have to be a subscriber. And how do you become a subscriber? Oh, said the Shah of Blah, that's much too complicated to explain. Anyhow, said Harun grumpily, I've never seen a water genie either. Rashid shrugged. You're never up in time to see the milkman, he pointed out, but you don't mind drinking the milk. So now kindly desist from this ifing and butting and be happy with the stories you enjoy. And that was the end of that. Except that one day Harun asked one question too many, and then all hell broke loose. And you can imagine what the question is, right? What's the use of stories that aren't even true? And it's not a question that Harun himself devises, but it's actually a question that is first asked by the wicked neighbor, Mr. Sengupta, I think his name is, who is also the one with whom his mother absconds, right? So he sort of imports from the forces of society and more literal-minded people this ultimate doubt of his father, and then his father falls into misery. So here it says, what's the use of stories that aren't even true? Harun couldn't get the terrible question out of his head. However, there were people who thought Rashid's stories were useful. In those days, it was almost election time, and the grand panjandrums of various political parties all came to Rashid smiling their fat cat smiles, to begging to tell his stories at their rallies and nobody else's. It was well known that if you could get Rashid's magic tongue on your side, then your troubles were over. Nobody ever believed anything a politico said, even though they pretended as hard as they could that they were telling the truth. In fact, this was how everyone knew they were lying. But everyone had complete faith in Rashid because he always admitted that everything he told them was completely untrue and made up of his own head. So the politicos needed Rashid to help them win the people's vote. They lined up outside his door with their shiny faces and fake smiles and bags of hard cash. Rashid could pick and choose. And then everything goes wrong. I will stop here. So what happens is after Harun asks this question, and his wife has run off, Rashid loses the power to spin fictions, and he sits there completely glum, and Harun has to go on a quest to restore the water supply from the Sea of Stories to his father, and he succeeds in a very complicated way, which is on the one hand generically fairy tale, but on the other hand, as you also have realized from what I read, right, sort of studded with contemporary allusions and humorous inventions like the glumfish or the hoopoe. The hoopoe is, I think in German it's a Wiedehopf, and the hoopoe is the main means of transportation for Harun to get where he has to go in order to find the Sea of Stories, which But what I remember, I haven't reread the whole book, but I think this idealized place of a sea it looks pretty much like Kashmir to me. So Kashmir is one of those ideal places which figure prominently in Rushdie's fiction. So, well, what's the use of stories that aren't even true? Well, I just started one which isn't true, right? Only in the sense that it resonates strongly with what really happened in Rushdie's life at the time. And you get absorbed in it, and it gives you something to think about, and it also makes you feel better. Which brings me to my final little parting gift, if you like. I happened upon a song called Turtles All the Way Down, which is from the breakthrough record of a country musician called Sturgill Simpson, which has the very intriguing title, Meta-Modern Sounds in Country Music. And you can kind of see the cover of the original, which is, well, for me, not in the best of taste, let's put it like that. Not my kind of record cover at all. I used to have a phase way back when I was actually listening to country music, but that's long gone. I'm not particularly avid country music listener. But I got kind of hooked by the title of this, and you can see that it has been a 10 years anniversary edition of the record, which has a much more sinister appeal, which ties in with, and I found that intriguing because I'm in one of my private incarnations a Deadhead, that is an adherent of the philosophy and music of the Grateful Dead. And they have this kind of iconology, right? And believe it or not, on 11th of January and in the days surrounding it, Sturgill Simpson was invited to join the caravan of Dead-related jam bands playing a great festival on the beaches of a place in Mexico, the name of which I forgot. And he played with all these people from the former Dead circles, and he joined the all-star band put together by Bob Weir, one of the surviving Dead members, and he could do a set all of his own with his own band. So he has been an anointed jam band Dead person by now, and I think this is one of the moments. What also happened, that's perhaps more significant, is that his musical style has really moved in a direction less country, to put it mildly. So while this record is country, basically, but with interesting sound effects and lyrics which are not country, the real mainstream breakthrough came with an album from 2016 called A Sailor's Guide to Earth. And that is an amazing white soul record. He uses the horn players from currently very established sort of black soul and funk label, and creates a record which is dedicated to his firstborn son at the time, where he, as the sailor, sort of explains how the earth works for him. Amazing, one of the best singer-songwriter records I've heard, and that's the stuff that I'm inquiring into, right? Singer-songwriter records. Then something must have gone slightly wrong. So he always, on the side, he's always playing more straightforward traditional country music, bluegrass and this kind of thing. But in 2019, he came up with a record, I think it was 19 or 20, he came up with a record called Sound and Fury, which is the exact opposite of anything that he has done. A very noisy, very rough-hewn mixture of southern rock, blues, and post-punk or whatever. And in order to piss off his record label, which was very happy to have him after the success of A Sailor's Guide to Earth, he actually got some leading Japanese anime producers to produce an anime film for it. That somewhat misfired because he won a Grammy for that. Actually, he did it to piss off his label, right? Throw lots of money out there. And I'm not particularly fond of the record, but there are a couple of really good songs which he has picked up playing just now. He ruptured his vocal cords, I think, in 2021 and couldn't sing for 3 years. And now he's picked up again and joining this jam band format in a much extended mood, sort of really improvising on his own tunes in what he calls the Why Not Tour. And there are some amazing concerts which you can all get through the jam band platform Nuxnet. So you can download a whole concert for, I don't know, 10 or 15 euros there. And he's, I have one recording of a full concert in Nashville where some of the users wrote, well, he certainly entered Nashville, the home of country music, with a blowtorch here. So that's, I really enjoy what he's doing with this current band. He's in Munich in March, and unfortunately it's one day to Germany and I cannot make it, but I would go there if I could. If you have time and like this kind of thing, check him out, he's interesting. Don't be confused. He made an oath at some point that after 6 records he would stop recording under the name of Sturgill Simpson. So before his latest record, he adopted the name Johnny Blue Skies. And now the tour runs under, I think, Sturgill Simpson featuring Johnny Blue Skies or something like that. And it's a bit complicated. He seems to be an interesting guy. But anyway, here's his fiction. This opens the record. And you see that he has this sort of Dylan-esque way of using words, which is not very country music, right? I've seen Jesus play with flames in a lake of fire that I was standing in, met the devil in Seattle and spent 9 months inside the lion's den. Not a very pure rhyme. Met Buddha yet another time and he showed me a glowing light within, but I swear that God is there every time I glare into the eyes of my very best friend. So this is a very loose way of writing the lyrics, right? This is also to a certain extent, I think, tapping into the kind of the mythology of country music, right? Outlaw country, Waylon Jennings, that kind of thing. Says, my son, it's all been done and someday you're gonna wake up old and gray. Go and try and have some fun showing warmth to everyone you meet and greet and cheat along the way. So I think what happens, it's hard to read it, but when you sing this, you realize that it has its own sort of appeal as lyrics. The second stanza is actually the one that gets us to the fiction topic. There's a gateway in our mind that leads somewhere out there far beyond this plane. Signification, to put it mildly and technically, right? Where, and that's perhaps a bit generic, reptile aliens made of light cut you open and pull out all your pain. And then, interesting point, right? Tell me how you make illegal something that we all make in our brain. Some say you might go crazy, but then again, it might make you go sane. Again, this ambivalence of fictions, right? Every time I take a look inside that old and fabled book, I'm blinded and reminded of the pain caused by some old man in the sky. Marijuana, LSD, psilocybin, and DMT. Sounds not very singable to me, but he seems to use the words more frequently. They all changed the way I see, but love's the only thing that ever saved my life. So you can kind of see how this sort of veers between originality and generics and sometimes even cliche, right? I mean, love saved all my life is certainly not the most original lyrics line that has been written in recent years, but there you have it. So don't waste your mind on nursery rhymes or fairy tales of blood and wine. It's turtles all the way down the line. So to each their own, until we go home. To other realms our souls must roam, to and fro the myth that we all call space and time. And I think that's a nice way of putting it, right? That we are kind of living, we pretend that space and time is the reality we're living in, but we're actually living, that's the myth, and we're living in the fiction, right? So it's a nice inversion here. I just play that in the end. Let me at this point thank you for being here in fairly substantial numbers. I have no idea how many people sort of watched this on Tim's, but I will have an idea once I see how many essays will come in on the next week, is it? 16th or something. So please do write these 2-page essays if you want to get the 3 credits. You don't have to write the essay if you make the lecture course part of an oral exam somewhere else. But beyond that, I'll just go through the essays then once they've all been submitted and give you the credits. Thank you very much, and here's Sturgill Simpson, if there is. Thank you. I hope to see you all again next term.